Welcome back to the Historian's Tome, where history becomes your gentle companion into restful sleep. Tonight, we journey back to the birth of a nation, to a time when 13 colonies dared to dream of independence. Before we begin, if you enjoy these stories, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Leave a comment below and become part of our global community of history lovers. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the remarkable story of the American Revolution carry you peacefully into sleep. Long before the first shots were fired, before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the seeds of the American Revolution were quietly taking root in the hearts and minds of colonists living along the eastern coast of North America. The story begins not with a dramatic battle, but with growing frustration over taxes, trade restrictions, and a distant government that seemed to care little for the people it governed. In the early 1760s, Britain found itself in a difficult financial position. The French and Indian War had just ended in 1763, and while Britain had won, the victory came at a tremendous cost. The British treasury was nearly empty, and King George III and Parliament looked across the Atlantic Ocean to their American colonies as a source of revenue. After all, they reasoned, the war had been fought partly to protect these very colonies from French expansion. The colonists saw things differently. They had fought alongside British soldiers in the war. They had contributed money and men to the cause. Many colonial families had lost fathers and sons in the conflict. Now, with the war over, they expected to return to their normal lives, to expand westward into the lands that had been won, and to continue their trade as they always had. But King George had other plans. In 1763, he issued the Royal Proclamation, which forbade colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. This angered many colonists who had dreams of owning land in these new territories. Then came the taxes. First was the Sugar Act in 1764, which placed duties on sugar and molasses imported from outside the British Empire. Colonial merchants grumbled but paid. The following year brought the Stamp Act, and this time the reaction was much stronger. The Stamp Act required colonists to purchase special stamps for all printed materials, from newspapers to playing cards, from legal documents to dice. The revenue would go directly to Britain. More importantly, violators would be tried in vice-admiralty courts without juries, which seemed to violate the colonists' rights as British subjects. In the streets of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, people began to protest. They formed groups called the Sons of Liberty, who organized demonstrations and sometimes intimidated the stamp distributors until they resigned. Colonial assemblies sent representatives to a Stamp Act Congress in New York, where they drafted petitions to the king. Colonial women organized boycotts of British goods, refusing to buy tea, cloth, and other imports. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," echoed through the colonies. The colonists believed that as British subjects they had the right to be taxed only by their own elected representatives. Since they had no representatives in Parliament, they argued, Parliament had no right to tax them. This was a fundamental principle to them, rooted in their understanding of British law and liberty. Parliament eventually repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but the celebration was short-lived. On the same day they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which stated that Parliament had the right to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The message was clear. Britain was backing down on this particular tax, but not on the principle that it could tax and govern the colonies however it wished. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, named after Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. These acts placed duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea imported into the colonies. The revenue would be used to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges, making these officials independent of colonial assemblies. The acts also established a board of customs commissioners in Boston to enforce trade regulations. Once again, the colonists organized boycotts. Colonial merchants agreed not to import British goods. Women formed spinning circles to produce their own cloth rather than buy British fabric. The boycotts were remarkably effective, and British merchants began to pressure Parliament to repeal the acts. Tensions rose in Boston, where British soldiers had been stationed to maintain order and protect customs officials. The soldiers were not welcomed. Colonists resented their presence, and frequent arguments broke out between soldiers and citizens. On a cold March evening in 1770, a crowd gathered near the custom house, taunting and throwing snowballs at a British sentry. More soldiers arrived to help him. In the confusion and tension, the soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 colonists. The event became known as the Boston Massacre, though it was more of a street brawl gone terribly wrong than an organized massacre. The killings shocked the colonies. The soldiers were put on trial, and in a testament to the colonists' belief in fair justice, they were defended by John Adams, a lawyer who would later become the second president of the United States. Most of the soldiers were acquitted, though 2 were found guilty of manslaughter. Adams believed that everyone deserved a fair trial, even those he disagreed with politically. In the wake of the Boston Massacre, Parliament repealed most of the townshend duties except for the tax on tea. King George and his ministers wanted to maintain the principle that they could tax the colonies. For a few years, an uneasy calm settled over the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. Trade resumed. People went about their daily lives, but beneath the surface, the fundamental disagreement remained unresolved. The calm did not last. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. The act actually lowered the price of tea, but colonists saw through this attempt to make them accept Parliament's right to tax them. If they accepted cheap taxed tea, they would be accepting the principle of taxation without representation. In ports up and down the coast, colonists refused to allow tea ships to unload their cargo. In Boston, Governor Thomas Hutchinson insisted that the tea must be unloaded and the tax paid. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 tea ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the cold water. The event became known as the Boston Tea Party. When news reached London, King George and Parliament were furious. They decided to make an example of Boston. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws that colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The Boston Port Act closed Boston Harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act restricted town meetings and changed the colony's charter. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than in the colonies. The Quartering Act required colonists to house British soldiers in their homes if necessary. These acts united the colonies like nothing before. Even colonists who had been moderate or uncertain now saw that what happened to Massachusetts could happen to them. If Parliament could take away Massachusetts's charter and close Boston's port, it could do the same to any colony. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Only Georgia did not send representatives. The delegates debated what to do. Some, like Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania, proposed plans to keep the colonies within the British Empire, but with more self-government. Others, like Samuel Adams of Massachusetts and Patrick Henry of Virginia, took a harder line. In the end, the Congress agreed to organize a complete boycott of British goods. They sent a petition to King George requesting that he address their grievances. They also agreed to meet again in May 1775 if their complaints were not resolved. Perhaps most importantly, they recommended that each colony begin training militia units to defend themselves if necessary. Back in Massachusetts, the situation grew more tense. General Thomas Gage, the British military governor, learned that colonists were stockpiling weapons and gunpowder in the town of Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. On the night of April 18, 1775, he sent about 700 soldiers to march to Concord to seize these weapons and, if possible, to capture Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were staying nearby in Lexington. But the colonists had an effective intelligence network. That night, Paul Revere and William Dawes rode out from Boston to warn the countryside that British soldiers were coming. Church bells rang and signal lights flashed from hilltops. By the time the British soldiers reached Lexington at dawn on April 19th, about 70 colonial militia members had gathered on the town green. No one knows who fired the first shot. In the confusion of that early morning, with both sides nervous and tense, a shot rang out, then more shots. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead and 10 were wounded. The British soldiers marched on to Concord. In Concord, the British found and destroyed some military supplies, but most had already been hidden. At the North Bridge outside town, colonial militia engaged the British in a brief battle. This time, the militia stood their ground and forced the British to retreat. As the British soldiers marched back toward Boston, they came under constant fire from colonial militia hidden behind trees, stone walls, and buildings. The march back became a nightmare. By the time the British reached the safety of Boston, they had suffered nearly 300 casualties. The news spread rapidly. All through the colonies, people heard about Lexington and Concord. The fighting had begun. There was no turning back now. Militia units from throughout New England converged on Boston, trapping the British Army inside the city. The American Revolution had started. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. They faced an enormous task. The colonies were at war, but they had no unified army, no real government, and many colonists still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. The Congress created the Continental Army and appointed George Washington of Virginia as its commander. Washington was a natural choice. He had military experience from the French and Indian War. He was from Virginia, which helped unite northern and southern colonies, and he was known for his character and judgment. In June, the first major battle took place. British General William Howe decided to break out of Boston by seizing the high ground on the Charlestown Peninsula. Colonial forces, hearing of the plan, worked through the night to build fortifications on Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. On June 17th, the British attacked uphill against entrenched colonial positions. The battle was fierce and bloody. The colonists, short on gunpowder, were told not to fire until they could see the whites of the enemy's eyes. The British eventually took the hills, but at a terrible cost. Over 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, about half of the attacking force. Colonial losses were about 450. The Battle of Bunker Hill, as it became known, proved that colonial militia could stand against professional British soldiers. It also showed that this war would not be quick or easy. As the summer of 1775 turned to fall and then winter, the war continued without a clear purpose beyond defending colonial rights. Many colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects who were simply resisting unjust laws. But opinions were changing. In January 1776, a pamphlet called Common Sense appeared in Philadelphia. Written by Thomas Paine, an English immigrant who had arrived in America only 2 years before, Common Sense argued powerfully for complete independence from Britain. Paine wrote in simple, direct language that ordinary people could understand. He attacked the idea of monarchy itself, calling King George a royal brute. He argued that it was absurd for a large continent to be ruled by a small island thousands of miles away. He painted a vision of America as a new kind of nation, a republic where people governed themselves. Common Sense became a sensation, selling over 100,000 copies in just a few months. It changed the conversation throughout the colonies. In the Continental Congress, sentiment shifted toward independence. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution declaring that the colonies were and should be free and independent states. Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration. The committee included John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, and Thomas Jefferson. They chose Jefferson to write the first draft. Jefferson worked in his rented rooms in Philadelphia, crafting words that would echo through history. He drew on Enlightenment ideas about natural rights and government by consent. He wrote that all men are created equal. that they have certain unalienable rights including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. He listed grievances against King George to justify the break with Britain. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted to approve Lee's resolution for independence. On July 4, they approved Jefferson's Declaration of Independence with some edits. The document was printed and sent throughout the colonies. In cities and towns, it was read aloud to crowds who cheered and celebrated. In New York, people tore down a statue of King George and melted it to make bullets. The 13 colonies were now the United States of America, a new nation born in revolution. But declaring independence was one thing. Winning it would be much harder. The British had the most powerful military in the world. The Royal Navy dominated the seas. British soldiers were well trained and well equipped. Britain had wealth and resources. The new United States had an amateur army that kept shrinking as enlistments expired. They had no navy to speak of. They were deeply in debt and had no way to raise money except by printing paper money, which quickly lost value. In the summer of 1776, a massive British force arrived in New York. General Howe brought over 30,000 soldiers, including many German mercenaries called Hessians. Washington's army was outnumbered and outgunned. In a series of battles around New York City in August and September, the British repeatedly defeated the Americans. Only skillful retreats and some lucky fog that covered American movements saved Washington's army from complete destruction. By late fall, Washington's army was in full retreat across New Jersey with British forces in pursuit. Soldiers deserted in large numbers. Those who remained were exhausted, hungry, and poorly clothed. Their enlistments would expire at the end of the year, and it seemed unlikely many would re-enlist. The cause of independence appeared hopeless. Thomas Paine, who had joined the army as a volunteer, wrote another pamphlet during this dark time, called The American Crisis. It began with the famous words, "These are the times that try men's souls." Paine urged Americans not to give up, to persevere through the hardship, to believe that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington made a desperate gamble. He led his army across the icy Delaware River and attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey. The attack came as a complete surprise. The Hessians, still celebrating Christmas, were unprepared. Washington's army captured nearly 1,000 prisoners and much-needed supplies. A week later, Washington won another small victory at Princeton. These were small battles in military terms, but they had enormous psychological impact. Washington had shown that the American army could win. Soldiers who had been ready to go home decided to stay. Recruits began to sign up. The cause had new life. The year 1777 brought a major British campaign that would change the course of the war. The British plan was to cut New England off from the other states by controlling the Hudson River Valley. General John Burgoyne would lead an army south from Canada, while General Howe was supposed to move north from New York. They would meet at Albany, isolating New England. But the plan fell apart. Howe decided instead to attack Philadelphia, the American capital. He loaded his army onto ships, sailed to the head of Chesapeake Bay, and marched on Philadelphia. Washington tried to stop him at Brandywine Creek in September, but was defeated. The British occupied Philadelphia in late September. Congress fled to York, Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, Burgoyne's army moved south from Canada as planned. At first, things went well for the British. They recaptured Fort Ticonderoga and continued south. But as they moved deeper into New York, problems mounted. The army was slowed by difficult terrain and lack of supplies. American forces under General Horatio Gates gathered to oppose them. Militia from throughout the region joined the American army. In September and October, 2 battles were fought near Saratoga, New York. The American forces, which included troops led by the aggressive and talented Benedict Arnold, fought well. Burgoyne's army was surrounded. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of nearly 6,000 men. It was the greatest American victory of the war so far. The victory at Saratoga had consequences far beyond the battlefield. In France, King Louis XVI and his ministers had been watching the American Revolution with interest. France had lost to Britain in the French and Indian War and wanted revenge. French volunteers, including the Marquis de Lafayette, had already gone to America to help the rebels. But the French government hesitated to openly support the Americans. They did not want to back a losing cause. Saratoga changed everything. Benjamin Franklin, who had been in Paris since late 1776 serving as American ambassador, used the victory to convince the French that America could win. In February 1778, France and the United States signed treaties of alliance and commerce. France would provide military support, including its powerful navy. Other European powers would eventually follow France's lead. Spain entered the war against Britain in 1779, and the Netherlands in 1780. Britain now faced a world war, not just a colonial rebellion. The winter of 1777 to 1778 was brutal for Washington's army, encamped at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, just 20 miles from where the British were comfortable in Philadelphia. Food was scarce. Clothing and blankets were inadequate. Soldiers suffered from cold, hunger, and disease. About 2,000 men died that winter, and many others deserted. But Valley Forge also became a place of transformation. A Prussian volunteer named Friedrich von Steuben joined the camp and began training the soldiers in European military tactics. He taught them to march in formation, to execute complex maneuvers, to fight as a disciplined unit rather than as a disorganized mob. Despite the hardship, the army that emerged from Valley Forge in the spring was stronger and more professional than before. In June 1778, the British decided to abandon Philadelphia and consolidate their forces in New York. As they marched across New Jersey, Washington attacked them at Monmouth Courthouse. The battle was hard fought in blazing heat. At one point, General Charles Lee ordered a retreat, but Washington personally rallied the troops and held the field. The British continued to New York, and Washington positioned his army in a semicircle around the city. The war entered a new phase. Major battles in the north became less frequent. The British, unable to crush Washington's army and now facing war with France and Spain, shifted their strategy. They decided to focus on the southern colonies, where they believed there were more loyalists who would support the British cause. In late 1778, the British captured Savannah, Georgia. In May 1780, after a long siege, they captured Charleston, South Carolina, along with over 5,000 American soldiers. It was the worst American defeat of the war. The British seemed to be succeeding in their southern strategy. General Charles Cornwallis led British forces in the south. He won a battle at Camden, South Carolina in August 1780, defeating an American army led by General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga. But as the British spread out across South Carolina and North Carolina, they faced unexpected resistance. The war in the South became vicious and personal. Bands of partisans and militia conducted guerrilla warfare against the British and Loyalists. Leaders like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens struck at British supply lines and outposts, then disappeared into the swamps and forests. Loyalist and patriot neighbors fought each other with a hatred that regular warfare did not have. It was civil war. Congress sent Nathanael Greene, one of Washington's most trusted generals, to take command in the South. Greene understood that he could not defeat Cornwallis in a head-on battle. Instead, he conducted a campaign of maneuver and attrition. He divided his army, sending Daniel Morgan with a force to threaten British outposts in the interior of South Carolina. At the Battle of Cowpens in January 1781, Morgan won a brilliant tactical victory over a British force led by Banastre Tarleton. Morgan used the militia's tendency to retreat to his advantage, drawing the British into a trap where his continental troops could strike them. The British suffered heavy casualties. Cornwallis, furious at this defeat, burned most of his supplies to increase his speed and chased the Americans through North Carolina. Greene reunited his army and led Cornwallis on a long pursuit through winter weather and muddy roads. The British army became exhausted. Finally, in March 1781, at Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina, Greene turned and fought. The battle was fierce. The British technically won by holding the field, but they suffered such heavy casualties that they had to retreat. Cornwallis decided to move to Virginia, where he hoped to find supplies and reinforcements. Greene, instead of following him, marched back into South Carolina to liberate that colony. Through the spring and summer of 1781, Greene fought a series of battles and sieges, gradually pushing the British back to Charleston. Cornwallis, meanwhile, raided through Virginia, causing considerable damage but accomplishing little strategically. General Henry Clinton, the British commander in New York, ordered Cornwallis to establish a naval base on the coast. Cornwallis chose Yorktown, Virginia, a small port on a peninsula between the York and James rivers. In New York, Washington and the French commander, Comte de Rochambeau, learned that a large French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was heading north from the Caribbean. They saw an opportunity. If they could get their armies to Virginia quickly, and if the French fleet could control the waters around Yorktown, they might be able to trap Cornwallis. It was a risky plan requiring careful coordination. Washington and Rochambeau marched their armies south, moving so quickly and secretly that the British in New York did not realize they were gone until it was too late. The French fleet arrived in Chesapeake Bay in late August. When a British fleet tried to dislodge them in early September, the French won the Battle of the Chesapeake, a naval engagement that was not particularly dramatic, but was crucial to the war's outcome. By mid-September, American and French forces had surrounded Yorktown by land, while the French fleet sealed it off by sea. Cornwallis was trapped with about 8,000 men. The Allies began a formal siege, digging trenches closer and closer to the British fortifications, bringing up heavy artillery to bombard the British positions. Cornwallis hoped that Clinton would send reinforcements from New York to rescue him, but they never came. By mid-October, his situation was hopeless. On October 17th, the 4th anniversary of Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga, Cornwallis asked for terms. On October 19, 1781, the British army marched out and surrendered. As the British band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," the soldiers laid down their arms. The surrender at Yorktown did not immediately end the war. British forces still occupied New York, Charleston, and Savannah. The Royal Navy still controlled the seas. But the defeat broke the will of the British government to continue fighting. In Britain, Lord North, the Prime Minister who had led the country through most of the war, resigned. The new government opened peace negotiations. The negotiations took place in Paris and lasted for 2 years. The American delegation included Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. They proved to be skilled diplomats. Britain recognized American independence and agreed to generous boundaries for the new nation, extending west to the Mississippi River, north to the Great Lakes, and south to Florida, which was returned to Spain. The Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783. The war was finally over. The last British troops evacuated New York City on November 25, 1783. George Washington, who had led the army for 8 long years, said goodbye to his officers at Francis Tavern in New York, then traveled to Annapolis, Maryland, where Congress was meeting. There, on December 23, 1783, he resigned his commission as commander-in-chief and returned to his home at Mount Vernon. His voluntary surrender of power amazed the world and set a standard for civilian control of the military. But winning independence was only the first step. The new United States now had to figure out how to govern itself. During the war, the states had operated under the Articles of Confederation, which created a very weak central government. Congress could not raise taxes or regulate trade. Each state acted almost like an independent country. By the mid-1780s, it was clear that this system was not working. In May 1787, delegates from 12 states met in Philadelphia for what became the Constitutional Convention. Rhode Island refused to send delegates. The convention was supposed to revise the Articles of Confederation, but the delegates quickly decided to write an entirely new constitution. They worked through the hot summer, debating and compromising. The result was the United States Constitution, a remarkable document that created a federal system with power divided between national and state governments and split at the national level among executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The Constitution was a series of compromises between large and small states, between North and South, between those who wanted a strong national government and those who feared concentrated power. The Constitution was sent to the states for ratification. Supporters called Federalists and opponents called Anti-Federalists debated intensely. The Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, explained and defended the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists worried about the power of the new government and the lack of explicit protection for individual rights. Gradually, the states ratified the Constitution. The promise to add a Bill of Rights helped win over many skeptics. In April 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first President of the United States. The government created by the Constitution began to function. In 1791, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, were added to the Constitution, protecting fundamental freedoms like speech, religion, and trial by jury. The American Revolution was more than just a war. It was a transformation of ideas about government and human rights. The revolutionaries created a new nation based on the principle that government exists to serve the people and derives its power from their consent. They rejected monarchy and aristocracy in favor of republicanism and democracy. The revolution was not perfect. The high ideals of equality and natural rights did not extend to everyone. Slavery continued in many states. Women had no political rights. Native Americans were pushed aside as settlers moved west. These contradictions would trouble the nation for generations and lead to future struggles for civil rights. But the revolution planted seeds that would grow over time. The idea that all people are created equal and have certain unalienable rights, though not fully realized in 1776 or even in 1789, became a standard against which the nation could be judged. Over the decades and centuries that followed, Americans would continue to work, sometimes through peaceful means and sometimes through conflict, to make those words from the Declaration of Independence a reality for all people. The story of the American Revolution is a story of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. They were farmers and merchants, lawyers and laborers, men and women, young and old. Many of them suffered greatly. Soldiers endured hunger, cold, and disease. Families lost loved ones. Communities were torn apart. But they persevered because they believed in something larger than themselves. They believed in the possibility of a different kind of society, one where people could govern themselves, where rights were protected, where merit mattered more than birth. They created a new nation that, despite all its flaws and failures, offered hope for a better future. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think of those winter soldiers at Valley Forge, of the farmers who stood on Lexington Green, of the delegates sweltering through a Philadelphia summer to write a constitution. Think of the long struggle, the setbacks and victories, the sacrifices and triumphs. The American Revolution was their gift to the future, a legacy of liberty that continues to inspire people around the world. Sleep well, knowing that their story is part of the great ongoing story of human freedom and dignity.